Nancy had never seen the man before, and she kept worrying about the matter. She intended to speak to her father about it, but found that he had invited a friend to dinner. By 10 o'clock, after a jolly evening, she had forgotten the incident. Before retiring, father and daughter both sat down in Mr. Drew's bedroom to discuss the mystery. Nancy at once brought up the subject of Emily Foster. "Don't you agree she's our best lead yet?" the girl asked. Mr. Drew did not answer. In fact, for several seconds he had not been paying strict attention to what his daughter had been saying. Now, so suddenly that Nancy was startled, he tiptoed to the hall door of her room. As she watched in bewilderment, he gave the knob a quick, deft twist. The door swung inward. A man in a brown suit was crouching just inside. Thrown off balance, he fell forward into the room. Chapter 15. Behind the Door. "So you were eavesdropping," Mr. Drew sternly accused the man who had been listening at the door as he pulled him roughly to his feet. "No, that's not true," the fellow stammered. Recovering his balance, he tried to retreat. Mr. Drew blocked the doorway. "Sit down," he ordered. "We want to talk to you." Nancy was glad her father intended to question the man. She recognized him as the one who had followed her. "What were you doing at the door?" Mr. Drew asked him sharply. "Nothing," he replied in a sullen voice. "I thought this room belonged to a friend of mine." "I'm afraid that's rather hard to believe, for you had your ear to the keyhole when I opened the door. Tell me your name." "It's none of your business." "I can turn you over to the police." "And I can report to them that you trailed me today," said Nancy. The stranger looked worried and squirmed uneasily in his chair. "You can't prove it." "This man followed you today?" Mr. Drew questioned his daughter in surprise. "Yes, I forgot to tell you about it." "Then that settles it," the lawyer announced grimly. "We'll turn this fellow over to the police for questioning." No, don't do that. I'll tell you anything you want to know, except my name." The eavesdropper could not know that Mr. Drew's threat to call the police was only a bluff. "Very well," nodded the lawyer. "Why were you following my daughter this afternoon?" "I followed her because I was to be paid a good wad to do it." "By whom?" "I'm not saying. Anyhow, I don't know the guy's name." "What were your instructions?" The fellow hung his head and refused to reply until the lawyer referred again to the police. "I was told to make a complete report on where she went, who she talked to, and what she did." Mr. Drew turned so that the man could not see him. With a quick movement of his hand and a jerk of his eyebrows, he signaled for Nancy to step into her bedroom. For a moment the girl was puzzled. Then it dawned on her that her father probably wanted her to slip quietly downstairs and make arrangements to have the stranger trailed. "So you won't tell us your name?" Mr. Drew repeated, gazing significantly at Nancy. "No, I won't," the man retorted. Nancy stole noiselessly from the room. Hastening downstairs, she used one of the public telephones to call the police station. Identifying her father and herself, she said, "Please send a plainclothes detective at once. I'll meet him in the lobby here and explain everything to him when he arrives." "How will I know him?" "He'll pretend to be lame." Nancy was worried lest the detective might not reach the hotel in time. In less than 5 minutes, however, a limping man walked in. The Drew girl told him why he had been called. She asked that he trail the eavesdropper when he should leave the hotel. "Here he comes now," she whispered, as the brown-suited stranger emerged from an elevator. "I'll get out of sight. He mustn't see me." Nancy secreted herself behind a pillar. She was pleased to observe that when the detective followed the culprit from the hotel, the latter appeared to be unaware of it. "I hope that's what Dad expected me to do," Nancy thought, stepping into the elevator. Mr. Drew was waiting at the door to his room. He assured his daughter that she had interpreted his signals correctly. The stranger, he reported, had been too nervous to notice the girl's absence. "By the way," Mr. Drew asked as they sat down, "have you telephoned to Mrs. Gruen since we left home, Nancy? There may be messages for us." The girl admitted that she had forgotten to do so. "You better put in a long-distance call right away," her father urged. The call was placed, and after a brief interval, Nancy heard Hannah's familiar voice. "How glad I am you phoned," she said at once. "I tried to reach you at Hampton, but the hotel clerk said you had left." "Is anything wrong?" "Mrs. Fenimore was here this morning. She wanted to see you very much." "Mrs. Fenimore?" Nancy echoed in surprise. Knowing that the invalid seldom left her cottage, she realized that only an urgent matter would have prompted the woman to undertake the trip. She wouldn't explain why she came, Mrs. Gruen resumed. When I told her you weren't at home, she said, you must be warned to be careful. Careful of what? She seems to think you're in danger. Oh, Nancy, I'll be so relieved when you're home again, safe and sound. We'll be back tomorrow, the girl assured the housekeeper. Don't worry about me. Nancy speculated as to why Mrs. Fenimore considered her to be in danger. Could the woman have learned that she was to be shadowed by the mysterious man in brown? Nancy and Mr. Drew waited until midnight for a report from the plainclothesman. When he failed to return to the hotel, they telephoned police headquarters. The detective had not checked in yet. In the morning, there was still no word, so Mr. Drew requested that a full report of the matter be forwarded to him at River Heights. Nancy lost no time in calling the Fenimore cottage after she arrived home the next afternoon. The woman was reclining on a couch, exhausted from the strain and worry of the previous day. I shouldn't have allowed myself to become so upset, she said to Nancy after she had greeted the girl. But Hector Keep always affects me that way. Then he came here to see you? I had a dreadful session with him. He asked me so many questions. About your sister? Yes, he wanted to know if I had engaged anyone to search for Floriana. Did you mention my name? Well, I did say you had offered to help me, Mrs. Fenimore admitted, though I felt unhappy about having told him. From the way Mr. Keep acted, I'm sure he intends to make trouble for you. I'm not afraid of Hector Keep, Nancy said defiantly. Oh, but you should have heard him talk. He said he wouldn't let anyone meddle in his affairs. He seems to think Heath Castle belongs to him. Mr. Keep is worried, Nancy commented, frowning. His remarks make it perfectly clear to me that he has a guilty conscience. Will you risk going to Heath Castle again? I'll certainly return there if it will accomplish anything, Nancy said with determination, but I believe this mystery may be solved in another way. She thought it best not to tell Mrs. Fenimore about the possibility that her sister might have been crippled as a result of an automobile accident. She merely said there was an interesting new lead to follow, which would not involve her coming in contact with the troublesome Mr. Keep. Immediately upon returning home, Nancy took stock of the mystery. Thieves probably were prowling around the Heath grounds, looking for something important. Did it have anything to do with Floriana? Was Hector Keep up to some underhanded work in connection with it? And then there's Emily Foster and the man who was eavesdropping. As Nancy opened the top drawer of her bureau to get a handkerchief, she spied the torn half-note she had found in the debris at the Heath factory. In the recent excitement, she had forgotten all about it. This may turn out to be my most valuable clue, she berated herself. I must try to figure it out. She sat down at once to piece out the message, but had hardly started when the telephone rang. The caller was George, wanting to know how the solution to the mystery was progressing. I have a clue to your stolen clothes, the girl laughed, and told of having seen a shirt similar to George's on Mrs. Hooker's clothesline. Why, the nerve of that woman, her chum exclaimed indignantly. I'm going there at once and demand that she give up my property. You can't prove anything, George, Nancy discouraged her. Better forget the matter for the time being and come here. I have lots to tell you. Bring Bess along. Be there pronto, George replied. As Nancy returned to her room, she said to herself, if it was Jetty who took those clothes, what was he doing in the Heath Gardens? Is it possible that boy is connected with the mystery? She was still trying to figure this out when the other girls arrived. Nancy told them everything that had happened on the trip with her father. Poor Floriana, Bess exclaimed. How dreadful for a wonderful dancer to have her career cut that way. I wish you could have found that nurse, Emily Foster, George added, but maybe she isn't even alive today. Well, what are you going to work on next, Nancy? This note, or rather this piece of a note. She produced the bit of paper, and together the girls pored over it for some time, each with a pencil and paper, trying to figure out the lines to form a logical message. Bess was the first one to claim having pieced together the missing words. Listen to this, she cried gleefully. I have it. Let's hear it, urged Nancy. Dear C, someplace is the secret which I hid in a wall. I want to be famous. If I find it, it will be a worthy work. George scoffed. Nobody would write a note with such uneven lines, and we know already something is hidden in a wall. Well, it fills in the missing words, Bess defended herself. One Guess this is as good as another, Nancy said kindly. For some little time, the three girls continued their deciphering. At least Bess and George did. Nancy, meanwhile, fell to dreaming. Suddenly, she jumped from her chair, saying, "The solution to this mystery might lie in this very house." Without explaining her strange remark, she ran from the room and down the stairs. In a few minutes, she returned, carrying a large book. "How in the world are you going to find Floriana with that?" asked George. What Nancy held was a portfolio of colored pictures and descriptions of famous old houses and gardens in England. Knowing the girl's interest in gardening, a cousin of Nancy's had sent the book to her several Christmases before. "I forgot I had these pictures," she said, quickly turning the leaves. "Girls, look here." "Heath Castle!" exclaimed George. "The original one in England, only of course it wasn't called Heath. And the gardens!" cried Bess, as they looked at picture after picture. Nancy was busy reading the description of them when suddenly a paragraph caught her eye. "Oh, George, Bess, listen to this. At last I think we've found the clue we've been looking for." Chapter 16. The Search Resumed. George and Bess studied the paragraph to which Nancy had pointed. It was a quotation in Old English, and they could not make it out. Nancy, who had learned to read the works of the old English poet Chaucer in high school, eagerly translated it. "I have hid my treasures in the niches of the cloister, through which, all unsuspecting, the gay men and fair ladies pass each day to bathe," she read. "Sounds quaint," said Bess. "How does it help us? Those words were written a long time ago about people who visited at the English castle, I suppose, and walked through a cloister in the garden to go bathing." "Why, don't you see?" Nancy cried excitedly. "Ira Heath built his estate here to resemble the one in England. Probably both he and his son knew about the cloister." "Granted," nodded George, "but where's our clue, Nancy? If the Heaths have a treasure to hide, wouldn't their cloister have been a good place in which to put it?" "I've hid my treasures in the niches of the cloister," George repeated the words softly. "Is there a cloister in the Heath gardens? I haven't seen one." Nancy turned the page, and the three girls gazed thoughtfully at the picture on it, which showed a long passageway flanked by columns leading toward a river. "This is it," said Nancy. "Oh, I wonder if there's one at Heath Castle." "You didn't notice it from the air or when you were in the tower?" Bess inquired. "No," answered Nancy slowly, "but there was something leading from the castle toward the river, a kind of tunnel covered with vines." "I'll bet that's it," said George enthusiastically. "Listen," she commanded suddenly. "Here comes somebody who might be able to tell us." From down the street came the strains of a familiar song. Presently the singer turned into the Drew driveway. He warbled, "Clams by the bushel, clams by the lot, clams for the kettle, clams for the pot." "Nancy," George continued, "I'll bet me Hardy can tell you about a cloister at the Heath Castle if it runs down to the water. That old sailor knows every inch of the Muskoka River." "It won't hurt to ask him," agreed Nancy. By the time the girls reached the kitchen door, Hannah grew and was about to step outside to look in Hardy's basket.